Greetings and salutations and welcome to Lost in Video. In my last retrospective, we took a look back at 2002's Death to Smoochie, a dark comedy. We're still on dark comedies, but this time we're going to go back to 1996 for one of my all-time favorite movies, The Cable Guy.
Don't you want somebody to love? Don't you need somebody to love?
The script for The Cable Guy was written by Lou Holtz Jr., whose day job was actually practicing law as an attorney. This remains Holtz's only film credit as a writer. Judd Apatow did a heavy rewrite on Holtz's script, which apparently was just a silly buddy comedy, and changed it to what we now know as The Cable Guy, although the Writers Guild of America denied him a writing credit and instead gave the sole credit to Holtz, despite the fact that his script was far different from Judd Apatow's version that was actually used in the film. Apatow was, however, credited as a producer on the movie, and he finally received a writing credit for The Cable Guy when the novelization of the movie came out, which I'm sure was very rewarding for him. This was Ben Stiller's second directorial effort after Reality Bites, which was released in 1994 to a less than enthusiastic reception, although it maintains a fairly decent Rotten Tomatoes score now. In 1996, Ben Stiller still hadn't become the big star that we came to see him as later, after hits like There's Something About Mary, Meet the Parents, and Zoolander, so at the time it wasn't really a big deal to anyone that he was directing this movie. Originally, Ben Stiller planned to star in the movie himself. He decided against it, however, and later Chris Farley was in talks to play the title role of the Cable Guy. However, due to a scheduling conflict and a contract with Paramount Pictures, Farley was obligated to make his follow-up to Tommy Boy, Black Sheep, instead, another movie that I love. Farley actually wanted to do Cable Guy more than Black Sheep, but when Sony had the option to get Jim Carrey for the starring role, they dropped Farley and paid Carrey a record-breaking $20 million to take the part, which at the time was the highest any actor had ever been paid to do one movie. That's a lot of money no matter what, but even more so back in 1996. For perspective, Carrey's co-star Matthew Broderick was paid $2 million to do the movie. The entire film's budget was $46 million, so almost half of that went to Carrey himself. Money well spent if you ask me, although I can't help but wonder what a Chris Farley Cable Guy movie would have been like. Sony was apparently so proud of this deal that they announced how much money they were paying Carrey before the movie was released. This worked heavily against the film as it set up high expectations which didn't mix well with the inaccurate assumption that Cable Guy would be a mainstream blockbuster comedy. Anyone familiar with the Ben Stiller show will see plenty of familiar faces in the movie, as the entire cast is featured, mostly in small but to me sometimes memorable roles. This is great, as although I wasn't aware of the Ben Stiller show while it was on the air, in the 2000s I did get all of the episodes of the show on DVD and absolutely loved it. It's just cool to see that Stiller got the cast members from his canceled TV show all little spots in the movie, especially since so many of them went on to become bigger stars later on. According to Ben Stiller himself, The Cable Guy was presented as a mainstream summer comedy blockbuster, while in reality it was intended to be a strange, pseudo-sexual dark comedy about two men who become toxically obsessed with each other. Not exactly mainstream. The cast of the movie is stacked from top to bottom, with so many of these actors going on to become bigger stars later. Jim Carrey stars as the Cable Guy, Matthew Broderick plays Stephen Kovacs, Leslie Mann plays Steve's love interest, Robin. The movie also features Jack Black as Steven's friend, Rick, as well as small roles played by Owen Wilson, Bob Odenkirk, Janine Garofalo, David Cross, Eric Roberts, and director Ben Stiller himself. John Ottman, who is also a film editor, did the score for the movie. It's nothing too special for me, but it's competent and it serves its purpose. In a twist, prior to the film's release, an extra actually got a hold of the movie's script and leaked it to a media outlet, revealing the whole story. When this happened, a lot of television cable networks allegedly became nervous that cable would be presented in a negative light, which Ben Stiller found odd because the story was more about a deranged man who worked as a cable guy. Sure, there are themes that the movie explores about the dangers of becoming too dependent on media, but it never should have been viewed as any kind of threat to the existence of media, more of a warning to us, the consumers, but we'll touch on that more later. Before we get into what happens in this movie, it's interesting to note that for Cable Guy's more robust and enthusiastic scenes, Ben Stiller took two takes. One was more lighthearted and comedic, and the other would be more aggressive and dark. If you enjoy this content, please give a like, share, and subscribe. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on the Cable Guy in the comments. Now, let's get back to what happens in the movie. The movie opens with our protagonist, Steven Kovacs, moving into a new apartment having recently split up with his girlfriend, Robin. The cable guy is 4 hours late to the cable installation appointment and initially screams in Steven's face as a joke, which you think might have raised a red flag for Steven, but not in this case because Steven's not that bright.
Well, maybe I shouldn't have come at all. Jerk off!
As we see right away, this cable guy is challenged by a speech impediment in the form of a lisp. Carrie's agent was very against him doing the lisp for the character and was constantly trying to talk him out of it. Obviously, Carrie did it anyway, which seems to annoy some people when they see this movie. However, I think it adds another layer to the character that can at times be quite funny when not simply adding to the awkwardness that plays throughout the movie.
I'm kind of a perfectionist. Perfectionist.
So in an overly unsettling sexual way, the cable guy begins to install Steven's cable. If you find that scene a little uncomfortable, well, so did everyone else on the set of the movie as Jim Carrey improvised it on the spot. It was actually Jim Carrey's birthday on the day they shot this scene, and on the DVD commentary, Jim tells a story about how motivational speaker Tony Robbins, who briefly appears in the movie, visited the set with an autographed photo of Carrey's favorite actor, Jimmy Stewart, as a birthday gift for Carrey, and how much Carrey appreciated that gesture. So, taking some advice from his friend Rick, played by Jack Black, Steven asks the cable guy to hook up all the movie channels in exchange for a small bribe. The cable guy pretends to be offended and outraged at this proposition, but he's actually fine with it, and hooks Steven up with the extra channels free of monetary charge, but then immediately pressures him into hanging out with him the next day to visit a local satellite dish. In between scenes on the television, we see Ben Stiller playing the Sweet Brothers, twin brothers who were former child TV stars until one murdered the other in cold blood. This murder is an entire subplot on its own, as we see the details of the case play out on TV in the background throughout the entire movie. They filmed the court scenes for these short television clips in a real courtroom, which is only mildly interesting to me since they are so brief that one might think that was unnecessary. Also, I never knew this after having watched the movie about 50 times, but when Ben Stiller's evil twin brother character appears in court, his normally black hair is actually dyed red. You can barely notice though, as red dye on black hair didn't work out that well, and it wasn't an important enough detail for them to try to perfect. Steven's career seems to be related in some way to building or designing home developments, although we don't get too many specific details because it doesn't really matter. We see one of the Ben Stiller Show alumni almost immediately as David Cross pops up as one of the board members that Steven is speaking to about designing some sort of new residential facility. Of course, Steven's boss, who is simply credited as Steven's boss, is a jerk and has hair plugs because it's 1996. The actor who plays the boss, Harry O'Reilly, had to shave some of his hair from his head and have fake hair plugs put on just for this part. Talk about dedication for a role for a character that doesn't even have a name. That man deserves some credit. So later, the cable guy forces Steven to hold up his end of the deal and picks him up in his creepy van to take him to a huge satellite, or, as the cable guy likes to call it, a ride on the information superhighway. During this scene, Carrie's cable guy gives a speech about things we will be able to do in the future thanks to satellite technology, such as playing video games online with people all over the world and endless media options, and so many of those things have actually come true since 1996 when this was released. Just kind of interesting. Here, the cable guy opens up to Steven, telling him how he didn't really know his father growing up and how the television was always there for him, which is pretty sad.
Reality isn't father knows best anymore. It's a kick in the face on a Saturday night with a steel-toe grip Kodiak work boot. A trip to the hospital bloodied and bashed.
The two bond, and the cable guy gives Steven some advice on how to win Robin back, advice that he of course memorized word for word from a recent episode of the Jerry Springer Show. At the end of the night, Steven finally asks the cable guy his name, even though he's been riding around in a van with him for hours. The cable guy's response is that his name is Ernie Douglas, but his friends call him Chip. The next day, Steven gets himself a date with Robin by using the cable guy's advice on what to say to her during lunch, word for word, because in movies, all it takes is a monologue to change somebody's mind. When Leslie Mann auditioned for the part of Robin, she did her line reading with Judd Apatow. The two would get married 2 years later and have been married ever since then. Jennifer Lopez, Selma Hayek, and Heather Locklear all auditioned for the role of Robin. The filmmakers were afraid the audience would find the character unlikable and felt that Leslie Mann's soft-spoken disposition was the best way to avoid that from happening. I personally don't think they needed to worry though, as Steven's character is the one that strikes me as the most unlikable. When Steven is playing basketball with Rick and some other friends, the cable guy shows up and ruins the game. Jim Carrey actually couldn't dribble a basketball, so he mimed it, and they added a basketball into the scene later, which is a fascinating use of effects at the time. In this scene, the glass on the backboard of the basketball hoop was supposed to fall backwards, but the pyrotechnics didn't work correctly, and the backboard glass kind of exploded everywhere, nearly harming Jim Carrey's stunt double and others. The pyrotechnician responsible for this error was fired on account of how somebody could have been injured, but they left the glass shattering shot in the movie because it actually turned out looking great. Angry about the disaster of the basketball game, Steven gets home and ignores the cable guy's phone calls. And by phone calls, I don't mean just 1 or 2 voice messages, we're talking double digits, which should be another red flag for Steven, but in this moment he simply finds them odd and annoying and he seems confused. While on his date with Robin, Steven makes a joke about his boss's hair plugs as they play a song that the filmmakers liked and were permitted to use in the movie itself, but not on the film's soundtrack. For anyone who is curious, the song is called Standing Outside a Broken Phone Booth with Money in My Hand by Primitive Radio Gods. By the way, it's worth mentioning, the Cable Guy's soundtrack is awesome. Steven and Robin's plans to watch Sleepless in Seattle on cable are put on hold when Steven's cable goes out and he's forced to call the cable guy for help. Cable guy fixes Steven's cable problem in exchange for a night hanging out with Steven. Based on his demeanor, we can see that the cable guy seems upset that Steven's with Robin, but Steven remains mostly clueless as the red flags continue to pop up with this guy. The movie shows us that the cable guy sleeps in his van watching television at night. A flashback shows us that even as a young child, television was his life, and that he always wanted a brother as well. This is pretty sad, and as we see him express this to his mom, she tells him that she's going out to happy hour to get him a new brother, leaving him home alone with what she calls Mr. Babysitter, which is of course the television set. So Chip takes Steven to medieval times for their friendship night. Jim Carrey loved filming at medieval times and was shocked the venue hadn't been used in a movie before, due to its theatrical presentation.
I can't believe somebody hasn't gone into this place and made it a set piece for a comedy movie. They really do an incredible show, and these guys are great horsemen. They do a wonderful night of entertainment.
At first, the cable guy and Steven seem to be enjoying themselves during dinner despite the lack of silverware, although Steven does bring this to the attention of dispassionate waitress played by Janine Garofalo, another Ben Stiller Show alumni.
I got a knife and fork.
There were no utensils in medieval times, hence there are no utensils at medieval times. Would you like a refill on that Pepsi?
Next, another Ben Stiller Show cast member in Andy Dick calls Steven and the cable guy to the fighting pits to strap on some suits of armor and fight each other. This of course was the cable guy's idea, and since Andy Dick is apparently one of the cable guy's preferred customers, he can do whatever he wants at medieval times. The sword fight isn't impressive at all, but both Carrey and Broderick actually trained to use their swords, which is probably a good idea if you're going to be swinging them around at each other. This is one of my favorite scenes in the movie, probably due to Carrey's traditionally over-the-top performance.
That's it, spirit. Let's give him a shout!
After their epic night at medieval times, they go back to Steven's apartment to see that the cable guy had an entertainment system installed into Steven's apartment without his knowledge. Somehow Steven doesn't realize how odd this is, and simply asks the cable guy to have all the stuff removed within a few days. In the meantime, they agree to have a karaoke party. Robin tells Steven that she's going out on a date, which upsets Steven, although the two are still separated. This makes Steven feel a little bit rebellious himself, and at the party, he hooks up with the only female his age who is present, never bothering to wonder why she's even there. It's his apartment. He also gives the cable guy a book on how to fix his lisp, which means the world to the cable guy. The cable guy even shows his appreciation by taking a picture of Steven making out with the girl in bed. Yep, all above board here. During the karaoke party, the cable guy performs his own rendition of Somebody to Love by Jefferson Airplane. Jim Carrey sang and recorded this entire song in his studio, and it's available on the Cable Guy soundtrack, which as I already mentioned is great. I absolutely love this performance, and I have no idea why, outside of Carrey's sheer charisma and the obvious fun he has with it.
Running down your bed.
The next morning, the cable guy is watching Ren and Stimpy while making breakfast in a show of good taste when Steven wakes up. Feeling refreshed and ready for a new start, Steven quickly flips out when the cable guy reveals that the woman Steven spent the night with was a prostitute. The cable guy tries to reassure Steven by telling him that he'd tried her out first, and of course that's not reassuring at all. Steven finally has had enough and kicks the cable guy out of his apartment.
Hey, who's my treat?
What do you mean it was your treat?
Apparently, they did around 30 takes of this scene despite having rehearsed it because it was basically filmed in one shot and thus a little trickier to just get right. Apparently, this was the scene that sold Jim Carrey on the movie when he first read the script. We see Robin on a date with Owen Wilson, who plays a real jerk. I haven't watched all of Owen Wilson's movies, but this is the only one I've ever seen where he plays a sort of bad guy, and he was pretty good at it because I could not stand him here. The cable guy feels the same way, even though what happens next is mainly just an attempt for the cable guy to get back on Steven's good side. To do this, he attacks and beats up Owen Wilson in the bathroom of the restaurant. Apparently, Owen Wilson was angry about the scene and didn't want to be beaten up by Jim Carrey. At the time, the filmmakers didn't know Owen Wilson that well and didn't realize he would not enjoy having his head stuck in a toilet and slapped around. What a weirdo. For how much Owen Wilson allegedly hated doing the scene, he can be seen laughing in a shot while Carrey's cable guy is assaulting him. Meanwhile, Steven sees the bathroom beating story on the news, but doesn't think anything of it. One of the most consistent and entertaining workers in the movie business, Eric Roberts, shows up on the television in a trailer for a movie about the Ben Stiller twin murder trial that's still going on at this time.
Cry, baby.
I love you.
Always been such
Tammy, don't.
Look who's
Tammy?
crying now.
Eric Roberts is Sam and Stan Sweet in Brother, Sweet Brother, The Killing of Stanton Sweet. Parental discretion advised.
Honestly, I would pay to see that movie. It looks amazing. The cable guy isn't done interfering with Steven's life as he goes to Robin's apartment to install cable that nobody ordered or asked for and puts in a good word for Steven while he's there. He tells Robin that Steven paid for the cable. His manipulation tactics work, and Robin actually sets up a date with Steven. When Steven gets another shot at Robin, he decides selfishly that he must only focus on her and her alone so that he can win her back. This is shown when he blows off his friend Rick, who he was supposed to go to a concert with. No offense to Leslie Mann, but a concert with Jack Black sounds way more fun than hanging out with her. When the cable guy tells Steven that he got Robin back for him, in an oddly dramatic and kind of sad scene, with heavy rain pouring down on them, selfish Steven tells the cable guy that he doesn't want to be his friend anymore. He has already seen how unstable this guy is, so it was really a great idea to say that to his face. In a reaction that everyone could see coming except Steven, the cable guy sets off on a path for revenge. He immediately calls Robin to tell her that he's worried about Steven, making it seem as though there's something wrong with him. Steven is arrested during an important work meeting for receiving stolen property by a cop who was at the karaoke party. Turns out that entertainment system was stolen, and the cable guy planted it in Steven's apartment so he could use it against him if he needed to. The cop who arrests Steve at work is played by Charles Napier, who also played a police officer in Silence of the Lambs, which this movie references in an improvised joke by Jim Carrey during the medieval times scene earlier. This is the same officer who was shown at the karaoke party earlier, so we know he's one of the cable guy's preferred customers, just like Andy Dick. Steven learns that Chip Douglas is a fake name and asks his friend Rick to look into the matter for him. The cable guy shows up at prison to see Steven pretending to be his lawyer, claiming his real name is actually Larry Tate now. There's also a dark homosexual subtext here, with Carrey recreating a scene from Midnight Express, pressing his chest against the glass while threatening to make Steven's life even worse unless Steven agrees to be his friend again. Once released from jail, Steven and Robin go visit his parents and family, only to find that the cable guy is there too. Robin invited him as he has presented himself to Robin and Steven's family as a close friend of Steven's and begins to turn them against him. This includes playing a perverted game called Porno Password with Steven's family. I wondered to myself who has ever played Porno Password, but on the DVD commentary, Jim Carrey reveals that he played it with his parents when he was younger and they found it fun. Weird. Bob Odenkirk appears here with only one speaking line in the movie, playing Steven's brother. Porno Password goes off the rails when Steven flips out and punches the cable guy after being secretly provoked. This, of course, turns Robin and Steven's family against Steven. Next, the cable guy sends video footage of Steven making fun of his boss's hair plugs to everyone at Steven's work, because apparently the cable guy even had cameras planted in Steven's apartment. This, of course, cost Steven his job, as he's fired as a result. Back in 1996, it seemed almost futuristic for someone getting fired based on a video that got posted on the internet, which is funny since that's a regular part of the reality that we all live in today. Steven is harassed by the cable guy in the parking lot in an eerie reference to the Friday the 13th films. He then has a terrifying nightmare about a green-eyed cable guy chasing him around his apartment. There's an alternate or extended part of this nightmare scene where the cable guy climbs out of the television in pursuit of Steven. People who came to see lovable and funny Jim Carrey were not pleased at the horror-ish aspects presented here. It's not really scary, but it's not what people expected to see. Eventually, Steven gets a call from Rick, who finds out all the fake names the cable guy has used in the past. Amusingly, they're all names of TV characters, even including George Jetson. Rick also discovers that he doesn't work for any cable company and was actually fired for stalking customers. Big surprise to Steven, who for some reason still needs to be told that the cable guy is bad news. Meanwhile, Jack Black's been saying that this entire time. Meanwhile, on the television, we see that the Ben Stiller killer twin trial is nearing a conclusion, with the jury about to announce a verdict. Next, Steven gets a call from the cable guy who tells him that he's taking Robin out somewhere, and when Steven hears the term information superhighway, he knows where to go. In a cool piece of trivia, the final scene on the giant satellite is actually filmed in Howard Hughes' Spruce Goose, with the rain being poured on the actors for days during the duration of the shooting for this. The Spruce Goose location is cool, but the rain sounds miserable, and apparently it was for the actors. So naturally, Steven confronts the cable guy at the huge satellite as the cable guy takes Robin hostage with a stapler and leads her up to the top of the tower. Steven of course chases in pursuit, where he and the cable guy have their big final fist fight, as was foreshadowed in the medieval times scene. At one point, Steven punches the cable guy in the mouth just right and it cures the cable guy's lisp, but Steven punches him again and it comes right back. With some meta humor, the cable guy remarks that they're at a cool location for an ending, and then it reminds him of the ending to GoldenEye, the James Bond movie that had just been released in theaters just a year prior to this movie. To be fair, it is a very similar set piece. Steven begins to realize that the cable guy really just wanted to be Steven's friend, but obviously he's got some serious mental challenges that he needs to overcome. At the same time, the cable guy realizes what a mess his life is and how television really has been the only thing he's ever known. This realization leads him to jump off the satellite thinking he will fall to his death. He lands on the satellite, breaking it just as the verdict for the Ben Stiller trial is about to be announced on TV. This cuts out everyone's television, and in this moment, everyone decides to rediscover reading again, including Kyle Gass in a small cameo. In real life, they'd be rioting and looting, and there would be anarchy in the streets, but this was a more hopeful sentiment, which I can appreciate. Books are good. Stuntman Bob Brown had to do the actual jump from the top of the satellite for the cable guy's attempted suicide, since obviously Jim Carrey wouldn't even be permitted to try something like that. The filmmakers were stressed when they did the stunt, as it was a dangerous one that was only being done to set up a joke about the cable going out everywhere. It is pretty funny, as after all the hype and build-up for Ben Stiller's killer twin trial, we never get a resolution or a verdict for that. And I think the reason why is because the message there is that media really isn't that important. How will learning the verdict of that trial affect our lives? The cable guy survives landing on the satellite, just barely managing not to get impaled on a spike, but most likely severely injuring himself. Steven ends up with Robin, and we get the sense that Steven has finally learned his lesson as well, although honestly, who really knows? He is pretty dense. In a touching moment before being life-flighted away, the cable guy tells Steven his real name. Without any hesitation, he reveals himself to be Ricky Ricardo as the I Love Lucy song plays while the helicopter lifts off the ground, which is just an awesome moment. As the cable guy is life-flighted away, a paramedic makes the mistake of calling the cable guy his buddy. Cable guy smiles as he has found himself a new friend. End credits. As I said at the beginning of this video, this is one of my all-time favorite movies. I remember when I was younger going to the video rental store and renting this out every week, back when video rental stores still existed. I didn't even understand all of the jokes at the time, but I knew I was seeing a different side of Jim Carrey in some way. His acting was still over the top, but it wasn't the same as The Mask or Ace Ventura. No, this was darker, and it felt like there was some subtext to what was going on, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. This dark story about the twisted and unlikely friendship between these two characters was just fascinating to me. That's not to mention, I find this movie absolutely hilarious. Some people say they hate the cable guy's lisp, but then again, I think it's funny, especially in moments where he tries to be intimidating. The character will do and say genuinely creepy things, but his lisp just puts it off-center by a hair in a way that makes it kind of absurdly humorous. This may also be the first movie I fell in love with where neither of the main characters are likable. We see things through Steven's point of view mostly, but he's not really a good guy. He usually just comes off as selfish and a bit dim-witted. Regardless though, he is the victim in a stalker scenario, and so we still mostly root for him to make it out of the situation safely. This movie certainly has something to say about the dangers of media and entertainment when we are exposed to it too much. For the cable guy, television literally became his identity. It's ironic as once again things have gotten so much worse for the world in terms of dependence on technology since 1996. For its time, this movie definitely was ahead of the curve in my opinion, and it is still relevant today in terms of a lot of its themes. Many people will find the flashbacks of the cable guy's childhood relatable as well, as many kids sadly really did only have the television to keep them company growing up. This adds some depth to the cable guy and makes his character sympathetic, which helps us to remain invested in what he does and what happens to him. There's something to be said for the millennial theme of feeling isolated from others despite being good with technology and having a dependence on media, and that's a strong part of what makes the cable guy who he is. There's definitely some subtext about homosexuality with the cable guy's character, but it's not overt, which in this case I think is the right choice because it's not really where the focus needs to be. It's there though if you look for it, as was the intention of the filmmakers, just enough so that you can see there's a deeper side to this with the cable guy's character. It's showing without telling too much. All in all, the combination of comedy with a dark story about both media and obsession are just perfect in my eyes. I don't know exactly where I would rank this movie among my favorites, but I would say it most certainly is in the top 20, if not higher. I'm happy that this movie continues to build a cult following because it is certainly a movie that deserves appreciation. Speaking of appreciation, if you've noticed and or enjoyed the music playing in this video, all credit goes to Karl Casey at White Bat Audio. Not only have I used some of this awesome synthwave music in my last two videos, but I really enjoyed listening to it in my leisure as well. I wanted to make sure to give credit and thanks because I really enjoy the music. Thank you Karl Casey and White Bat Audio. Well, that just about does it for this retrospective. If you've seen The Cable Guy, and I really hope you have if you watched this whole video, then I hope you enjoyed revisiting this with me. Thanks for stopping by, and thanks for getting lost in video. See you next time.
1, 2, 3. Don't you